let me talk about the numbers of immigrants and refugees worldwide. And what you can see here is that from 1980 to the present day, the number of people who are living outside their country of birth has more than doubled. So in 1980, there were about 100 million people who were considered to be international migrants. In 2013, that number was 232 million people. And when we think about refugees and asylum seekers, these are people who have been forced for some reason to leave their country of birth, seek asylum in another country. The numbers have climbed from 9 million in 1980 to 18 million in 2013. So the numbers are rising rapidly, and this is a big issue worldwide. Okay, putting this in context in terms of how Canada compares to other countries, these are the numbers of numbers of immigrants in different countries in 2011, the most recent year for which we have these data, and the percentage of the population that these immigrants represent. So what you can see for Canada is that we may not have the largest number of immigrants, but we have a very high percentage of our population that is immigrants, more than 20% now of our population were not born in Canada. You can see Australia is a little bit above us. United States has a lot of immigrants, but they also have a huge population, so it's about 13% of their population. Okay, so I don't know whether everybody knows a lot about immigration, and so I thought I'd just talk a little bit about policy and the similarities and differences across countries. One of the similarities is that many countries have the same categories of immigrants or immigration. So we bring in people to Canada and to many other countries under something in Canada called the economic class. This is bringing in people to contribute to the economy, to fill our labor market needs, etc. Okay, so Canada has a very large economic class. Countries like the United States have bring in immigrants for employment and to boost their economy, but the numbers and the proportions are much smaller. Many countries have a family class of immigrants. This is bringing in people who are relatives. So you might be able to bring in parents or grandparents, children, etc. In the United States, that's a huge part of their immigration policy, is bringing in family members. In Canada, it's a smaller proportion of our policy. And then, of course, there's humanitarian immigration, bringing in people who are refugees and asylum seekers who need a new place to live. So that's a similarity across a number of countries. The number of countries have these three categories, but there are huge differences among countries in how we really frame immigration in our policies. So, for example, the balance of these categories is really different across countries, as I said. Canada has a very large economic class of immigration. It's our biggest category. In the United States, for example, it's family. The main policy bringing in people is through family class. There's a difference in terms of how immigration is framed and whether it is talked about in terms of limits or targets. So, for example, many countries talk about limits, how many immigrants they're going to, their maximum number that they're going to bring in. And they talk about this in limits, and I think the language is important because it's saying that they're going to control immigration. In Canada, we talk about targets. So when we set immigration levels for the next year, when Citizenship and Immigration Canada sets their limits or their numbers for the next year, they talk about it in terms of targets. And I think this is more welcoming because we're talking about the need for people, and those are the targets of what we want to bring in. So this is really focused on control versus need. In some countries, there's a big emphasis on control. In some countries like Canada, we do talk a lot about our need for immigration and need for immigrants. There's differences among countries in talking about illegal immigration. So every time I go and talk in the United States about immigration, people say to me, well, in Canada, what about illegal immigration? And I say, well, you know, that's not a big focus in the Canadian context. And then, of course, there are differences in the rights that immigrants have. In Canada, immigrants have a lot of rights, maybe not as many as we would wish, but they do have rights, and in some countries they have very few rights in terms of obtaining citizenship, health care, all sorts of things. Okay, so I thought I'd just show you the numbers of new permanent residents that were admitted to Canada in 2013. These are the numbers for the year, the most recent year for which we have data. And as you can see, the largest category is economic immigration. We're bringing in immigrants who are skilled workers, business immigrants, people coming in through something called the Canadian Experience Class, which has to do with international students, people who have experience working in Canada. Our provinces and territories can nominate and bring in immigrants who they need in that context, etc. Now, this 57% of the immigrants being brought in are not only the skilled workers, but it includes their family members. And then we have a family class, which is representing about 31% of the immigrants coming to Canada. And this includes spouses, partners, dependent children, parents and grandparents. Some of you may have read that the age of dependency has now gone down. So now to bring in your children as immigrants through the family class, they have to be under 19. It used to be a higher age, but I guess we've decided that children are adults at a younger age. And the parents and grandparents category is very limited. It closed for a while and it reopened for a short time and filled very quickly. There are very small numbers of parents and grandparents being brought in. Refugees and their dependents represent about 9% of immigrants coming to Canada being brought in. And then there's another category which represents a category where the government has discretion on bringing in additional people who make appeals. In terms of source countries that people are coming from to Canada, these flip around a little bit, but the main source countries in recent years for immigration to Canada include China, India, and the Philippines. So for a year or two, the Philippines was the top country. In 2013, it was China. Okay, before I talk about dehumanization of immigrants, I do want to put this in context. And these are data from the German Marshall Fund of the United States. And what I like about this is that Canada is included, because we're not always included in these comparisons. And this was a question that was asked in a number of countries. And it was the item that people had to respond to was, do you agree or disagree that immigration is more of a problem than an opportunity? And what you can see is that in the United Kingdom, over 60% of people said that immigration is more of a problem than an opportunity. Fortunately, in Canada, less than 30% of the population agreed with that statement. Okay, so the context I'm trying to set here is attitudes are not completely negative in Canada. They're quite positive towards immigrants and immigration. But of course, there's room for improvement. Okay, so what I want to talk about mainly today and focus on is this issue of depicting immigrants and refugees as a problem and the role that the media plays in creating these problems. And so these are just some headlines talking about murderers and rapists that we can't throw out, that migrants are perhaps not learning the language of the country they're coming to, that there's a backlash, that they need to be taught manners. And this language of flooding, so migrants set to flood in, this suggests that there are waves of immigrants that are just hammering at our door trying to get in. So the media does play a large role in framing public policy and discourse about immigrants and refugees. And over the past 10 to 15 years, portrayals of immigrants and refugees in many Western countries have become increasingly negative. And there's a focus on problems and a focus on threat. And just to talk about some of the research on this, Cisnero looked at American television news and found that immigrants are represented as dangerous, destructive pollutants that have to be controlled in order to prevent contamination. Clocker and Dunn looked at Australian newspaper articles and government media releases and found that the language depicted asylum seekers as illegitimate, illegal, threatening, criminals, and terrorists. In Canada, Matani and Muntz looked at Canadian newspaper coverage of the arrival of migrants off the coast of BC, and they found that these asylum seekers were described as an invasion, as a flood, bogus, diseased, and terrorists. And most recently, Stellian Medianu, Lena Sutter, and I looked at Canadian newspaper portrayals of refugees before and after the arrival of the Tamil refugee ships to Canada in 2010. And we found that the language included depictions of refugees as terrorists and as bogus, but also as victims. So first of all, you may be asking yourself, why negative portrayals? That's what I ask myself anyway. Why are there these negative portrayals? And I have to say that immigration is a really contentious issue, and it involves a lot of uncertainty and unease. We don't know the answers to a lot of questions about immigration. How many immigrants should we be accepting each year? What type of immigrants should we be accepting? What are our obligations to refugees? Are they legitimate? Are they healthy? Are they a threat? And I would say that the public has very little direct evidence to answer these questions, and as a result that the media can take advantage of this uncertainty to create what we would call a crisis mentality, in which immigrants and refugees are depicted as enemies at the gate who are trying to invade our country. And these depictions take relatively mundane events, the arrival of a boat of 500 people, for example, when we're accepting, 250,000 a year? And they take this event and they transform it into a newsworthy issue that can be sold to the public. The public, we know, prefers negative news stories. We know that if the headline includes a crisis, people are more likely to read it. And we know that positive stories are less newsworthy. The day-to-day lives of immigrants in our community tend to be seen as less interesting, exciting than a crisis. So one-sided negative media portrayals can serve to reduce uncertainty. They provide answers. Are they good or bad? Should we accept them? And tell us how we should be treating people. And what these portrayals have in common, and what I want to talk about next, is this issue of dehumanization. So these are pretty extreme examples. This guy, he's the immigrant, he's coming, he's brown, he's foreign, he's different, he's not quite human, and then this blame them for everything, these immigrants who are going to take your jobs and your wives, wreck your way of life, and basically they'll do all these bad things to us. So these are pretty extreme examples, but I would suggest that the media does this as well. So before I get there, let me talk about what dehumanization is. And dehumanization has to do with the denial of full humanness to others and their exclusion from the human species. And so if a group is considered not quite human, we don't have to treat them as humans. They're outside the boundary in which our moral values and our principles of justice apply, and we don't have to give them everything that we have. And dehumanization may include perceptions of a group as inhuman by using categories of subhuman creatures like animals, or by using categories of negatively evaluated superhuman creatures like monsters, like that cartoon I showed you. Okay, it's difficult to measure dehumanization, and so there have been a number of ways to get at this. One strategy has been to look at perceptions of a group as lacking what are considered to be uniquely human values, such as pro-social values. And these are seen as the hallmarks of what it means to be human. So if a group doesn't have these values, it's a way of dehumanizing them. We also can measure dehumanization by looking at perceptions of a group as having barbarian characteristics, enemy characteristics. They're crude, they're unsophisticated, they're ruthless, they're irrational, they're immoral. And Leon in the Canary Islands actually looked at perceptions of a group as experiencing primary emotions as animals do. These are the very basic emotions, but not secondary emotions as humans do. So there are a lot of different ways of getting at dehumanization, and I'm going to talk about some of these today. Oops, wrong way. Okay, so what I mainly want to focus on now has to do with the media portrayals and the dehumanization of immigrants and refugees. And the question that our research has been looking at is whether there's a causal relation between negative media depictions of immigrants and refugees and the dehumanization of these groups. Lots of people and lots of researchers have claimed that these depictions are dehumanizing, but what we've done is done experiments to look at the causal connection between reading these media depictions and leading to dehumanization of these groups. So I'm going to talk today about 3 experiments. And these experiments were all based on real depictions of immigrants and refugees in the print media. And as I mentioned earlier, these have to do with immigrants as sources and spreaders of infectious diseases. The idea that refugee claimants coming to our country are bogus queue jumpers. They're trying to get in without waiting their turn, and they're not necessarily real. And the idea that refugee claimants are often terrorists in disguise. Whoops. Keep going the wrong way. Whoops. Okay, so the association of immigrants with disease, and as you can see, even Ebola has led to backlash against, in this case, Latino immigrants. I love this article because what it's saying is that some senators and some Senate candidates have talked about how we shouldn't be, or the United States shouldn't be letting people in across the Mexican border because they may be bringing Ebola. And if you look at the caption here, there are no reports of Ebola in any Latin American country. Okay, so this association of immigrants with disease, the idea that the other people may be bringing in something that will harm us. This other article is something that was in the Winnipeg Free Press a few years ago, and it talked about somebody who, when you look at that suitcase, was bringing in something nasty, some disease-laden something. And the article goes on to talk about how this guy brought in some sort of disease to Canada. So we did an experiment to test this. Does reading messages that talk about immigrants and disease, or seeing cartoons that talk about immigrants and disease, lead to dehumanization? And what we did was that we showed people, incidentally, so they weren't told to focus on it. I'll show you what they were looking at in a minute. They saw a cartoon incidentally on a page that they were reading, and it showed an immigrant arriving in Canada. And the person was carrying a suitcase, and the suitcase either had labels of diseases or no labels of diseases. So people looked at this article and looked at this cartoon, and then after this, we asked them some questions about immigration and about immigrants as sources of disease. So people came into the lab, and this is what they were asked to read. And they were told that this was 2 separate studies. They were going to read this article, and we were looking at memory for text. And they read this article about Steve Martin, Confessions of an Anti-Comic. And they were told that we were going to ask them some questions about that afterwards. And what you can see is in the bottom, there was a little editorial cartoon of this guy arriving at Immigration Canada with his suitcase. So importantly, people were not told to focus on this cartoon, and in fact, after the study, we asked people some questions about the cartoon. We said, who was the guy behind the desk? Who was the guy carrying the suitcase? The majority of our participants in this research said, what cartoon? Okay, so they didn't necessarily know that they'd seen it or pay attention to it. And there were 2 conditions. So in one condition, the guy came and he was carrying a suitcase, no disease labels. Whoops, I don't want to show you that yet. Okay, in the other condition, he was shown carrying a suitcase and it had the names of diseases. That's it, just at the little bottom corner. And then people went to another room and completed some questions about immigrants and disease and their attitudes toward immigrants. So first of all, what was the effect of viewing the cartoon on perceptions of immigrants as a source of disease? And what you can see here is that when they saw the guy with the suitcase with the names of diseases on it, they were more likely to say immigrants bring disease to Canada. This despite the fact that they didn't even necessarily claim that they had seen this editorial cartoon. What about dehumanization? So what you can see here is that people were more likely to dehumanize immigrants by saying that they don't have human values when they saw the picture of the guy with the disease labels on his suitcase. We also included a measure looking at this enemy barbarian image. They were more likely to say that immigrants are barbarians or enemies when they saw the guy with the suitcase with the disease labels. This is emotions toward immigrants. So do you feel contempt towards immigrants, and do you feel admiration or lack of admiration? These are all, for contempt, they're all negative, so they're not expressing a lot of contempt, but still a significant effect, so that they're more likely to feel contempt when the guy's got the suitcase with the disease labels, and they're more likely to say that they don't admire immigrants when that guy was carrying that suitcase with the disease labels. And finally, attitudes toward immigrants and immigration are less favorable. So these aren't huge effects, but they're significant effects. By seeing something which they don't even know they're looking at, they weren't told specifically to focus on it. And this is just a model looking at the connections among these things. And what you can see, just by looking at the arrows, is that the labels influence whether people see immigrants as a source of disease, which leads to dehumanization, leads to negative emotions, and then leads to negative attitudes. Okay, so next time you're looking at the newspaper and you see this editorial cartoon, you think it's not having any effect on you, maybe it is. Okay, the next claim, the claim that refugees are bogus queue jumpers. So this language of bogus, fake, etc. And what we're interested in, does this language then lead to dehumanization? So people again came into our lab and they were asked to read an editorial about refugees. There were two versions of this editorial. One version talked about Canada's costly refugee program, and then it talked about how refugee claimants are bogus and that they're trying to take advantage of the Canadian system. This was the real editorial that we used from a newspaper article. We made an alternative version of that article where we talked about the costly refugee program, but we did not depict refugees as bogus queue jumpers. And then again, we looked at dehumanization, emotions toward refugees, and attitudes toward refugees and toward Canada's refugee policies. So this is a real article. It was in the Financial Post quite a while ago. And I mean, it says refugees are not people who have been displaced and are brought in for humanitarian reasons into Canada. Only a few are in that category. Most are smuggled in. They're queue jumpers. They lie their way into the country by pretending they can't go home. There's no proper adjudication process, etc. And then the mayor at the time talked about the motels around the airport filled with so-called refugees. They come here by plane, they have passports when they board, and then they flush them down the toilet and they claim refugee status. So they're fake. So this was the real article. And we also created, as I said, an article where we didn't talk about them as being bogus. We gave a definition of what refugees is. This is the official definition. So refugees are people in or outside Canada who fear returning to their country of nationality or habitual residence because of a well-founded belief that they will be persecuted. Okay, so two versions of this editorial, and what happens when people read these two different versions. Okay, so first of all, when people read that refugees are bogus queue jumpers, they're more likely to dehumanize them. They're more likely to express contempt towards them, say they don't admire them. And then finally, their attitudes toward refugees and toward refugee policies become much less favorable. Okay, so I've talked about this association of immigrants with disease. I've talked about the idea that refugees aren't real. Now I want to talk about this final study, which is based on the arrival of the Tamil refugee ships off the coast of BC a few years ago. And these are some of the articles that appeared at that time. So for example, Canada's on a closer watch for terrorist travel. This word terrorist. Is the migrant ship carrying terrorists or refugees? There was also a lot of talk about them being bogus. So I should say that the arrival of the Tamil refugees in British Columbia in 2010 was greeted with quite a bit of negativity. And I'm kind of ashamed to say that this Angus Reid poll in 2010 found that 63% of Canadians agreed with the statement that the ship should have been turned back and not allowed to reach Canada. This despite the fact that people don't really know very much about the Tamil refugees coming to Canada. If you ask most people, they don't know a lot about the background. And the actual number of Tamil refugees to Canada has been decreasing over time. There were around 500 people on board the ship. It had originated in Sri Lanka, and it was already denied permission to dock in Thailand and Australia. And if you saw the pictures of the people coming off that boat, they weren't people who had a lot and were coming to invade our country. They looked, I would say, quite pathetic and could have elicited empathy under different conditions. And so in this case, we were interested in looking at whether these types of articles would lead to the association of refugees with animals, okay, the ultimate dehumanization. And these are just some quotes talking about refugees, suggesting this animal association. And things like the Syrian refugees in the Turkish camps are we wild animals? And then this last one, I often say that asylum seekers are like cockroaches because it is take, take, take. Okay, not very favorable. Okay, so similar procedure. We created 3 versions of the article about the arrival of a group coming to Canada. In this case, we used a fictitious group because we didn't want to be influenced by people's preconceptions at this point about the Tamils. So we used a group that we called Sanderians. We asked people afterwards who the Sanderians were, and people had all sorts of theories about it. It wasn't a real group, but people believed it was a real group. And we said that they were arriving on the east coast of Canada. And what we looked at was something that I will call automatic dehumanization through association with animals. And we used what's called a sequential priming task, which I'll tell you about in a minute. The use of automatic dehumanization means that we don't have to ask people for their explicit attitudes. Because if I ask people, do you think refugees or do you think a group is animals, most people know they're not supposed to say yes. So what we're looking at is the automatic association, the spontaneous reactions that people can't necessarily control, where they may be associating a group with animals. And it doesn't require people to explicitly express their true beliefs. So we changed the article. It looked like a real article. It was presented online to people. And we changed the headline and some of the text. This is the bogus condition, where we said suspected bogus refugee claimants are entering Canadian waters. This is a terrorist condition. Suspected terrorist refugee claimants are entering Canadian waters. And then refugee claimants are entering Canadian waters. Okay, so 3 different conditions. A neutral one just talks about the arrival of this group. It doesn't use this language. Okay, so this just is a depiction of what the procedure is. And basically you come into the lab and you're looking at a computer screen, and the first thing you see are these plus signs on the screen for 500 milliseconds. And you're supposed to focus on those, and then very quickly a word comes up. 200 milliseconds, so you don't really necessarily even know you're seeing this word, and the word is either Canadian, refugee, or no word. And then you're told that what your task is to categorize some pictures. The pictures are either pictures of humans or animals, and the categorization task is either that you're categorizing them as humans or animals, or you're categorizing them as positive or negative. Okay, so you come in, a word flashes, and there are lots of trials. A word flashes, it's either Canadian refugee or nothing, and then you're supposed to be categorizing these words that are animal or human. And what we're looking at is whether the refugee prime makes you faster to respond animal when you see an animal, which suggests that there's an association between refugees and animal. It's more complicated than that, but that's the gist of it. So we had 4 positive and 4 negative human pictures. And we had 4 positive and 4 negative animal pictures. People are categorizing these using keys on the computer. And what we're looking at is the speed with which people are responding. And does the word refugee make you faster to be categorizing animals? Okay, so these are calculated on the basis of people's response times. And I'm not going to go into those calculations, but I will say higher numbers indicate more dehumanization. And the red bars are refugees, the gray bars are Canadians. So when you see the word refugee, you're much faster to respond to the animal words and to categorize those. It's a bit more complicated. But anyway, you're more likely to dehumanize, and you're more likely to associate refugees with animals. So you're faster at the animal words. And what you can see is that when people read the article that talked about refugees as bogus or as terrorists, they're more likely to automatically dehumanize and to associate refugees with animals. And this only happened after reading the bogus or the terrorist article, not the neutral article. Okay, so basically reading those articles, even if you don't have any awareness of what you did, makes you faster and makes you more likely to be associating refugees with animals. Okay, so just to sum up, I'm going to just talk a little bit about the implications of this work. And what I would say is that it uncovers some of the processes that are involved in stigmatization and exclusion of immigrants and refugees. And as I said at the beginning, Canadians' attitudes toward immigrants and immigration are relatively favorable, but media depictions of immigration-related issues can promote dehumanization, as these experiments demonstrate. I think it's important to mention that the materials we used were based on real depictions of immigrants and refugees in the media. We altered these, but we started with real articles. And these are common depictions: the association with disease, the idea that there are terrorists coming to Canada, the fact that they're bogus, they're maybe not real. Just to remind you, the incidental viewing can have significant effects. So people who saw that cartoon didn't really pay attention to it. It still affected them. And so that, I think, is pretty important. And also the automatic dehumanization. So reading some of the common messages that are prevalent in the media can increase the automatic association between refugees and animals, which is really the ultimate dehumanization. And then, as some of the earlier studies showed, dehumanization can lead to negative emotions, it can lead to less favorable attitudes, and it can lead to exclusion. I love this slide. So I want to just talk a little bit now about solutions and what are the solutions. And I would say that the solution has to do with humanizing people, thinking of all people as members of the human group. And this is, I ain't afraid of no boats. These are people protesting the detention of refugee asylum seekers in, I believe, Australia. And really the solution has to do with humanizing people. So I'd say the solution depends on people who don't necessarily hold dehumanizing beliefs. They're not as susceptible to the fear tactics that are used by the media. And it's important to be humanizing these groups, to provide information that makes people see immigrants and refugees as individuals, as members of our own group that we can identify. We can identify with your behavior, we can identify with your plight. And finally, the media may be willing to present these depictions if we can convince them that this is sometimes what people want to see. We sometimes want to know about the lives of others, and there's soap operas on TV. We are interested in day-to-day lives, and presenting the day-to-day lives of immigrants and refugees may go a long way to humanizing them and making us be able to empathize and see that they're like us and we're all part of the human group. And I'm open for questions, and if you have further questions after this, please send me an email or visit our website. But first, I'll open this up for questions. Thank you.